Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you all for being here. My name is Arik Burakovsky, and I serve as the Associate Director of the Center for Expanding Viewpoints in Higher Education here at Tufts University. At the center, we're trying to cultivate a particular kind of intellectual environment that fosters open inquiry and treats disagreement constructively. That means asking difficult questions, engaging competing perspectives, and doing so in a civil and rigorous way. Tonight's conversation is part of our 2025-2026 headliner programming on the future of the American left and right. And it focuses on a question that is both analytically complex and politically consequential, and especially timely. How demographic change is reshaping contemporary political divides in the United States. Shifts in racial and ethnic composition are interacting with patterns of geography, class, education, and identity in ways that are still unfolding. They're influencing political coalitions, policy priorities, and broader narratives about who the country is and who it is becoming. These are not questions that lend themselves to easy answers. They require us to think carefully about evidence, interpretation, and the assumptions that we bring to the table. Our goal this evening is not necessarily to resolve these debates, but to clarify them, to better understand the competing frameworks through which they are being interpreted. I should note that this event is being photographed and video recorded. In terms of the format, we will start with a conversation between our guest speaker and our moderator, and then we will open things up for questions from the audience. When we move to Q&A, please feel free to raise your hand, and we will bring a microphone to you. You're welcome to introduce yourself or remain anonymous as you prefer. We encourage questions that are thoughtful and, when appropriate, challenging, but we ask that they be posed in the spirit of genuine engagement and respect. Following the event, we will have a reception outside in the lobby, and at 8 p.m., any students who wish to continue the conversation are welcome to join us for a discussion in room 171 here in Eden Hall. This is the first time we're doing a post-event student conversation, and all of you are welcome to participate. Before we begin, I want to recognize everyone who made tonight's event possible, especially our student leaders and our student staff, whose initiative and attention to detail are essential to the center's work. I also have a brief note for all these students in the room. We are hosting our inaugural student-led conference, the 2026 Expanding Viewpoints Symposium, in a couple of weeks. The event will bring together college juniors and seniors across Greater Boston, as well as some active sophomores who are involved in the center, to discuss how contemporary populist movements are reshaping American politics and public life. The application deadline has been extended to the end of this week, Friday, April 3rd, and we strongly encourage you to apply if you're interested in participating in more sustained conversations of this kind. With that, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Tufts Senior Nicholas Rishi, one of our student leaders, who will introduce our moderator and our speaker. Thank you all again.
Well, thank you for that, Arik. I'm really thrilled about tonight's event, and I'm so happy that everyone is here for it. We're pleased to be joined tonight by Reihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, a research and advocacy organization that aims to advance opportunity, individual liberty, and the rule of law in America. Mr. Salam received his bachelor's degree from Harvard University in social studies after transferring from Cornell. Before joining the Manhattan Institute in 2019, he served as the executive editor of National Review. He previously worked for the New York Times op-ed page and NBC News. Mr. Salam is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a contributing editor at National Affairs and National Review. He's the author of Melting Pot or Civil War, which makes the case for a skills-based immigration policy, as well as Grand New Party, How Republicans Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream, which he co-wrote in 2008 with Ross Douthat. He's a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves on the Public Scholars Advisory Committee at the Moynihan Center at the City College of New York and the Advisory Council for the Public Interest Fellowship. We are also pleased to have Professor Deborah Schildkraut of the Tufts Political Science Department as the moderator for tonight's event. Her research and courses include American politics, public opinion, political psychology, racial and ethnic politics, and immigration. She's the author of several books, including States of Belonging, Immigration, Politics, Attitudes, and Inclusion, and most recently, Everyday Democracy, Liberals, Conservatives, and Their Routine Political Lives. With that, I am pleased to hand it over to Professor Schildkraut for tonight's event.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Nick, for that great introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here today. Thank you to ARC and Eitan for inviting me to be the moderator today. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the water. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to join us. So, as lovely as this renovated room is, it doesn't have a clock. So I'm just going to look for cues from ARC about 20 minutes of us talking back and forth, and then we'll turn it over.
Or we'll watch as their eyes glaze
all of
over
you.
and they grow more and more tired and cranky.
Usually professors need a clock in the back of the room so we can see. All right, so welcome everyone, and I'm just going to jump right in and get us started. I'll ask you some questions, we'll see where the conversation goes, and then we'll open it up to all of you.
I just want to thank
yes.
all of you for being here. It's really neat that you guys are curious enough, bored enough perhaps, but it's really a delight. I think that part of what's so neat about this enterprise that Arik and Professor Hirsch and that Professor Schildkraut are all engaged in is this idea of enlivening our capacity for citizenship, for active, curious citizenship. And I'm really, really proud to be here. I've learned an enormous amount from Professor Schildkraut's work. It's a real pleasure to get to be here with her, but also from Professor Hirsch. I've got to say, you guys are really privileged to have such a formidable group of scholars here who are thinking really deeply about how to address some real questions, anxieties about the role of the university in public life. So thank you for being here.
Great, thank you. So whenever we have guests and we have students in the audience, I always like to start off by asking people about their career path. I'm sure we have students here who either would like to work for you, work near you, or someday have a career like yours. And so can you just tell a little bit about how you went from being an 18-year-old college student to the life that you have now and the topics that you get to focus on day to day?
So this also relates to how I think about immigration, class, much else. My parents were intellectually inclined people. However, when they settled in Brooklyn, New York in 1976, they, just were taking the jobs that were available to them at the time. But I certainly grew up in a house where there was a lot of intellectual curiosity, there was a lot of reading, there's a lot of exposure to, being in a city that was in the middle of an enormous amount of change and flux. We saw it happen around us. So I went to an exam school in New York City called Stuyvesant High School. And Stuyvesant was a really precious place. Partly because, this was in the 1990s, and first of all, it was a place where nerds didn't have to be afraid of getting beaten up. That was a great thing about Stuyvesant High School. And also, it was just a place full of a lot of bright, ambitious people who were commuting from all over New York City. And because of that, you just really got exposed to a lot of things. I certainly got exposed to a lot of things, people, communities I never would have encountered otherwise. It was an experience that really widened my horizons. So I just started reading. Again, we had magazines around the house, but I remember when I was 15 years old, reading this one book at a Barnes & Noble. I really should have paid for it. I went back and paid for it later with my allowance money. And then I just went through all of the footnotes of the book, and I just kind of started working my way through it. And the person who wrote that book was an editor at the New Republic magazine. Now, as it happens, years later, fast forward ahead to when I was, I just graduated from college, I decided to apply for a job at the New Republic. And that was my first job out of college. And, it's funny because when I was in college, I hadn't realized, there's a recruiting process. You start getting internships after your sophomore year. I just wasn't aware of that at all. So I remember showing up senior year to a recruiting meeting, be like, oh gosh, everyone's already done these things. Well, what will I do? I do like to read magazines. Maybe that's something I can do. So, in classic fashion, I thought, let me do this for a year and let me apply to law school. And, that's what I was planning on doing. But then I thought, you know what? I'm going to stick with this. This is, a domain where, my particular habits and dispositions seem to not be a demerit, seem to be something that's helpful. And it was just a way of being a student. It was just a way of continuing to be a student, continuing to ask questions, continuing to read, and have that be something that was not a distraction, but that was the kind of heart of the work. Now, there are many other aspects of that work. One thing that I really prized was the social dimension of the work. There are a lot of people who are great writers. I had the great privilege of knowing a lot of people who are great writers. I was an editor for a long time, so a big part of my job was identifying talented people, commissioning them. But what I really liked was the social aspect in a way, and the aspect of, call it mentorship. And again, it wasn't always mentorship. These were in many cases peers or even people older than me, but that art of identifying what is it that this person really has to say and contribute? How do we weave this into some larger politics of the coalition, some larger thesis? How do I make use of this person's energy and ambition and curiosity? I mean, this sounds very cynical and terrible, but it's true. We had goals. I had there are things that I wanted to accomplish in the world, and finding people with great ideas and encouraging them or browbeating them or, kind of making sure that they turn things in on time. This was actually part of the art of building a larger community. And that's really something I loved so much. So the writing for me was more instrumental. The writing was about, how do I send out a homing beacon into the universe to identify those people who will be part of the shared project, the shared enterprise that I wanted to be a part of. So, later on, I wound up getting a job running an institution. And in a way, that was taking on the things that I really thought of as my core work, that work of building a community, identifying talented people, supporting those talented people to do different kinds of work that might not make sense to them even at the beginning, but shaping that in a way where you can make it sustainable. So yeah, I think that I started out with this kind of curiosity, I guess, and then I was really lucky enough to find people who allowed me to turn this into a job.
So it sounds like maybe a grounding in social science and the humanities was important for you.
Yes. So my sister, as it turns out, is a sociologist. And again, I don't have the grounding that Professor Hirsch has, that Professor Schildkraut has, but, certainly I've always engaged with that work. Now, I will say for some of you who are undergraduates, some of you who are students right now, I regret some of the ways that I approached my undergraduate education. I was always more of an autodidact type, and I think that I did not use those years as well as I might have. I used them in other ways. What I did was I emailed a lot of people. Email was this thing that people used to do where you use your computer, and I'm kidding. I just kind of wrote people and I reached out to them. And what I did was hey, I read this thing that you wrote. I'm curious about it. And hey, I have this idea that might be of interest to you. So trying to make myself useful in that way. So even then, a lot of my community was, yes, it was on campus with friends and what have you, but I didn't necessarily find professors that actually I did have one that I really bonded with, Samuel Huntington, who is someone who is very influential, around these debates, someone who is, seen as a very controversial figure. And he was someone who is a, great friend and mentor to me, and someone who I certainly disagreed with about some things and agreed with about other things. But, that was certainly one really rewarding relationship. But otherwise, I guess I saw that college experience primarily as being about the relationships I was forming with other people, the arguments I was having with fellow students, and also getting access to libraries. Taking out a wheelbarrow full of books, reading a third of them, returning them, and kind of rinsing and repeating that. That was a really great luxury of being there.
Great, thank you. So we recently had a faculty panel event on campus reflecting on the U.S. at 250, and faculty were asked, given their area of expertise, what's on their mind as the U.S. approaches this milestone? And so I thought we would also pose that question to you. What's on your mind, given what you do day in and day out as the country approaches this milestone?
So one of the things that's on my mind is how we think about the American story in light of the fact that, and I kind of, this surprised even me, but my parents came to the United States in 1976, so the bicentennial year. So the semi-quincentennial is extra meaningful to me because of that. And, one thing I think about a lot is that, my parents are immigrants who arrived as part of this larger post-1965 wave. You've undoubtedly heard about that. And, of course, there is this, big migration that is ongoing from Latin America, from Asia, from Africa, something that was kind of new and distinct, of highly variegated, very diverse population. But I'm really struck by the fact that if you're looking at post-1965 immigrants, the children of those immigrants, and now the grandchildren of those immigrants, together they represent about a third, close to 1/3 of the US population. So that's a lot, right? That's a pretty big population. I have children who are third-generation Americans. I'm part of an ethnic population. My parents are from Bangladesh, which is a country that has seen explosive growth since 1990. So when my parents arrived in 1976, the Bangladeshi origin population was negligible. Now there were, so-called Lashkars, there were ship jumpers who had kind of settled in Harlem and in other parts of the country. There's certainly a South Asian presence that was kind of further back. But if you look at this population, really its growth exploded post-1990. So I certainly think about that and reflect on it a lot. But one thing I think about is, okay, so you have these populations, this very diverse influx. The Mexican component of that influx is kind of quite big and quite enormously consequential unto itself, but these other populations too that in aggregate have had a really big, complex effect that have been incorporated into the working class, the lower middle class, but also the upper middle class, also the American elite. And what I find interesting is how are these stories being incorporated into a larger American story? How many of you know the name Cesar Chavez? Okay, so Cesar Chavez was someone who, that was part of a project. That was part of this effort to think about how do we fit in Mexican Americans into a larger narrative of American history, of American progressive history. Now, some of you may have read a recent New York Times story revealing some ugly things about Cesar Chavez's life and past. So, it comes to mind in particular right now. But, the idea was, how do we think about Mexican Americans as part of this larger civil rights struggle or a labor struggle? How do we think about the struggle to belong, to be incorporated? Now, what about for Indian Americans or for Colombian Americans or any of the population? In the mid-'70s, some of you will recall Schoolhouse Rock. And I think about Schoolhouse Rock, and I think about this effort to how do we tell stories that kind of incorporate the present into the past? How do we relate our sense of the past, our reading of the past, to our future? How do we renew and replenish our future? How do we make it relevant to people who are part of these newcomer populations? Professor Schildkraut and I were talking about, Kosciuszko, the great Polish general who kind of helped, kind of train soldiers during the Revolutionary War. Why were we talking about Kosciuszko? Well, partly because this was a way of talking about Polish Americans, that Polish Americans had a history that stretched back. Crispus Attucks. How many of you guys remember that name? Maybe fewer people? Okay, so, when I was growing up, going to public schools in Brooklyn, New York, we learned about Crispus Attucks as a black resident of Massachusetts who was involved in these kind of roiling protests against the British colonial authorities. Why was that important? Because we were trying to find some way to kind of retcon a kind of inclusive American past to kind of offer people a way into being a part of that past. Many of you guys have probably seen Hamilton, whether in person or maybe streaming on Disney+. That was another example that feels almost innocent, almost a product of a different time, of how do we kind of incorporate those stories, how do we make them relevant? And I think a lot about that right now, because I think that a lot of the ways that people assimilate, a lot of the ways that people are making sense of their role in American life doesn't have that kind of mid-century aspect to it, doesn't have that aspect of what is the kind of heroic story, what is this kind of positive story of incorporation and how people fought for incorporation but then became part of the family. Instead, I see very different narratives about incorporation. And I guess I think that there would be something good and healthy about trying to tell mythic and kind of positive stories about these newcomer populations and what they mean for the American future.
Thank you. Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about a line that a friend of mine once wrote where she said, "Every day I get to be an American, but I don't feel like an everyday American." And I feel like there's a whole volume in that quote and in what you were, in some ways, the universality of that feeling is some of what I hear you saying, and that for each group and each person to figure that balance out for themselves and trying to change those lines of belonging, or sometimes you belong and sometimes you don't belong, and what are the factors that shape whether you're feeling like an everyday American or that you are American, but not an everyday American.
One thing I've been thinking about recently is the experience of second generation populations that are upwardly mobile. So there's a terrific book that came out a couple of years ago called Streets of Gold. And what's great about this book is that it's basically talking about patterns of immigration and assimilation across generations. And one of the stories it tells is that, look, if you're looking at the late 19th, early 20th century, and also if you're looking at the present, typically upward mobility in that first generation is limited and constrained. Really, the big gains are typically made in the second generation and beyond. Again, this is a kind of a common and persistent pattern. But, it looks different for different populations, of course. One thing that I find interesting is, this idea of our country. When you think about assimilation, it's not one thing, right? We're a pluralistic country. So you would expect that assimilation itself would be a pluralistic phenomenon. The intellectual historian David Hollinger, 30 years ago, coined the term quintuple assimilation, almost as a joke, but saying that what we're doing is we're actually, we have this ethno-racial pentagon. You're Black, you're Asian, you're Hispanic, et cetera. And actually what people are doing is, kind of coming from their, various traditions that are rich and complex, and then being extruded into one point along the ethno-racial pentagon. You're going from being, a kind of, whatever, you're a native person from Oaxaca, but then you become Hispanic or Latino. You know what I mean? You kind of are if you're fitting into this thing created by the census or created by the imperatives of marketing or, the form that you fill out when you're, applying to college or whatever else. And one thing that I find interesting is this idea that if you are rising into the American elite in an age where discourse in elite academia and media is very critical, Lionel Trilling had this term, the adversary culture. In the late 50s, early 1960s. This idea that there was an elite culture in America that felt adversarial to the American mainstream. And so years later, I thought I had coined this term, but lo and behold, it was created by this guy named Robert Lycan. I thought of the term adversarial assimilation. What does that mean, adversarial assimilation? So, think about being someone who is upwardly mobile as a second generation American, but who is also at the same time alienated. Why are you alienated? Norman Podhoretz coined this term, the brutal bargain. The idea that assimilation is a brutal bargain. You get something, but you also give something up that could be very precious, and the feeling that you need to give something up that is very precious. So adversarial assimilation can mean a lot of different things, but one is this idea that, yes, I'm being incorporated into this country, but I'm looking at this country through an angle of, maybe it's an angle of exclusion, or maybe it's what some scholars call the paradox of integration. What the paradox of integration means is that, in a way, you could think, oh, cool, I'm totally included, like, that's awesome. But actually, the more included you are, the more you see the ways in which you're actually left out. You know what I mean? So if you're thinking hey, I just arrived in this country and I get to have a job and I'm making good money and this is amazing. This is so cool. Then you learn, oh, wait, there's some people who are going to a place called Tufts or Choate or something like that. Or, actually, I thought we were all hanging out in the break room and we were kind of doing this thing, we're chatting here, but there's some people who are hanging out, on the weekend together, doing this other thing that I'm not a part of, right? So the paradox of integration, a society that actually is quite inclusive, but also creates all of these new lines of fragmentation, all these ways in which actually I'm not fully included, whatever that means. And also it's just, kind of the idea of a society that is kind of anti-institutional, right? A society where there's a kind of, the counterculture becomes the elite culture. And so I find that really interesting too. You see some really prominent, important figures in American public life who've risen to the zenith of American public life. And yet the way they've done that is through a narrative that, by the way, I totally believe is authentic and real, of being wounded and being excluded. Zoran Mamdani is an extremely impressive politician. He is an incredibly charismatic figure. I might disagree with him about, almost everything, but, he is someone who, from one vantage point, could be seen as a triumph of 21st century American pluralism and inclusion. But the story that really moves him, the story that makes him cry, is the story about the ways in which he felt he and his family members had been mistreated or spoken ill of in the wake of 9/11. Now, my father worked in the World Trade Center. I grew up in New York City my entire life. And that wasn't my experience, as a Muslim American. And that's not to say that my experience was valid and his wasn't. But it's interesting that as a wildly successful American politician, that's the story that is the kind of salient, meaningful one for him, right? And if you're thinking about applying to, maybe not in 2026. But, when I was applying to college, 30 years ago, or, just the idea that, well, your personal statement, what makes your personal statement interesting as an Indian American growing up in Scarsdale High School? Is it that, gosh, I really loved Kuman and it was amazing and I could have learned a lot of great things? And, oh gosh, well, my mother was a lawyer, but my father, that's not very interesting. What is interesting is what was some experience of having been wounded? And by the way, that could be totally genuine. It's not artifice. You know what I mean? It could be that what was some experience of experiencing, maybe not, using that language, the paradox of integration. And that has become a way that, upward mobility works. That is the way that storytelling works for people in American life right now. And I think it's interesting. And I think that it's one of those things that has a kind of trickle-down effect on the wider culture. So adversarial assimilation is one pattern. There are many other assimilations that we can certainly talk about and think about that are certainly shaping our politics. But I do think that it's something that, I've certainly given a lot of thought to.
I have a question on here about Mayor Mamdani for you. So I can remember a time when the mayoral election in New York garnered the national attention that this got, and the impact it had on the Democratic Party, but also on the Republican Party. And I also was viewing him as an embodiment of what the theme of tonight's talk is, right? Demographic change and what this signals about partisan politics, about electoral politics, about ideology. And there's so much we can say about that, and I'm sure we will. But the other thing that's noteworthy is now that the election is done, the attention is a bit less. He's still in the news a bit. He's certainly in the New York Times a lot, but not the national attention as a New Yorker, and as all that election symbolized and how it relates to what you do professionally. How's it going so far?
Well, there are a lot of different ways to answer that, but I'd say that through the ethno-demographic lens, I think it's really, really interesting. Okay, so if you're looking at New York City 30 years ago compared to today, actually New York City isn't actually much less white than it had been 30 years ago, which is kind of a surprise. New York City's been a majority-minority city for a long, long time. What does majority-minority mean? These are all kind of shifting categories. But what's interesting is that call it the non-Hispanic white population, this is kind of a silly convention, but that population, is not much smaller as a share of the overall city's population, but it's different. It's really, really different from the kind of white population that I grew up with when I was growing up in Brooklyn in the 80s and 90s. One big way that it's different is that when I was growing up, this was a multi-generational population. This was a population that still had some ancestral memory of its kind of European immigrant origins. Think, Italian, Irish, a Jewish population that was kind of different in composition and character than the one we have now. So if you're looking at that era of New York City's revival, through that kind of 80s, 90s, 2000s, it was very heavily driven by immigration. Something happened in the 2000s, which is the balance started to shift from immigration being the big source of kind of demographic vitality in New York City to being college-educated professionals, disproportionately white. Another interesting part of the story is that New York City has become less black since 2000. So, kind of it went from being about 1 in 4 New Yorkers to about 1 in 5 and shrinking. And of course, the composition of the black population is also different than it had been before. So I mention all of this because when you're looking at, so let's say the kind of immigrant influx represented kind of 2/3 of the influx and 1/3 was kind of educated, predominantly white, college-educated professionals, it flipped. So by the time you get to the de Blasio years, it was more like 2/3 college-educated white professionals. The big influx that you had during the Biden presidency, that was kind of an aberration, but where we're actually returning to kind of, what had become the recent norm for a variety of reasons. Part of it is that the countries that were the big drivers of immigrant replenishment in the 80s and 90s, these are countries that now have very low fertility levels. Fertility is another theme that I think we should come back to. But these are countries, for example, the number of Korean Americans Korean-born individuals, in the United States actually shrank between 2010 and 2020. It's totally, totally fascinating. But when you think about the fact that Korea itself is a country that is shrinking and shrinking pretty rapidly, it's not that surprising in that context. But anyway, that was something that really changed the city, and it changed the economic and civic trajectory of the city. That immigrant influx really revitalized a lot of these outer borough neighborhoods. But then you have this different population. You have a college-educated population that feels incredibly precarious. You have a college-educated population that, by the way, is not entirely white. It's a multi-ethnic population that feels precarious, that feels downwardly mobile, and that has given rise to this interesting new politics. So if we're thinking about Zoran Mamdani, his coalition, and why I think that he's nationally relevant, I think that that's a really, really important part of the story. A lot more to say about that.
I think I have dominated long enough this question period. We're going to open it up to the audience.
I guess I was interested in what you had to think about fertility rates and its effects on, American demographics, immigration patterns, possible future policies. I mean, I know there's a strong pronatalist bent in a faction of the Republican Party now, how that might affect future policies and so on and so forth.
I almost feel like I planted this question because it's a question that I find so fascinating. So a lot of different ways to approach this. One is that if you're thinking about immigration and how it's shaping American politics, but also more broadly American life, the fertility context is really important. So if we had the same birth rates in the United States that we had at the peak of the baby boom, and had they continued through to the present, the immigrant influx that we've had since the mid-'60s would have had a really different effect on the country. Why? Because think about it this way. In 1900, the typical native-born American family, family size would have been much, much bigger, right? You would have had, kind of 3 kids, 4 kids, something like that. So what that means is that when you have newcomers, and again, this depends on geography as well, assimilation means something different, when you are a newcomer in an environment that's dominated by multi-generational old stock Americans. Now, if you're a newcomer in an environment that is dominated by other newcomers, that's different, right? That's not to say that you're not assimilating, because assimilation, can mean many different things, but part of it is that you're assimilating to the norm. And the norm itself is something that is itself dynamic and changing over time, right? And the pace of change is shaped to some degree by the kind of fertility context, let's say. So then think about this through a political lens, okay? So if you are looking at a context in which older generations feel very tied to younger generations through fertility. Hey, a lot of these younger people are my grandchildren. You might have a different view about investing in infrastructure or public education or whatever, or your sense of mastery or connection, the sense that the American future is connected to the American past in a way that is comforting and recognizable. But when you see that rising generations are very disproportionately composed of people who are different, well, different how, different in what sense? There's this really neat paper that was just published called Red Immigrants and Blue Immigrants. And the basic argument is a lot of people have different theories about how Americans think about immigration. Is it sociotropic? Is it egotropic? Are they thinking about their own interests or the interests of the wider community? Is there a hidden consensus that we all want a certain type of immigrant or what have you, regardless of partisan affiliation, et cetera? This is a big, long-standing debate. And what this article posits is that actually what people really care about is, will immigration help their team? That is, will the newcomers vote Republican or will they vote Democratic? So, the classic trope is that, well, liberals like immigrants, because they're cosmopolitan, they're open, they believe in an inclusive, conception of American identity. What this paper suggests is that no, if you tell Democrats that actually the newcomers who are coming are going to vote Republican, they will say, how do we deport them as quickly as possible? I actually, it sounds like a joke, but it's true. I was actually even surprised by this. And then if you tell Republicans, hey, did you know that Venezuelans, the ones that, people are trying to get rid of them through, did you know that they vote Republican? Well, in that case, actually, let's keep, so anyway, it's just kind of funny when you think about, what are the kind of loyalties that matter most? What are the allegiances that matter most? And in a polarized climate, the thought of are immigrants us? Or are they not us? And to some degree, that usness actually is really about partisan affiliation. So to go back to the fertility question, look, this is a deep, durable trend that appears to be taking hold in every society. It's often said that sub-Saharan Africa is one place where you continue to have above replacement fertility. Israel is the one modern market democracy where you have above replacement fertility. But in sub-Saharan Africa, certainly, the trend is downward. If you look at South Asia, other places that, had pretty robust fertility until relatively recently. Many different theories as to why that's the case. So then that introduces interesting possibilities about human survival and the human future. What are the populations that continue to have above replacement fertility? And will they exert disproportionate influence over the future? There are a lot of different interesting questions here. And that's why a lot of progressives, a lot of secular or cosmopolitan liberals are actually thinking about fertility as a kind of long-run challenge for their kind of worldview and the kind of persistence of the kind of values that they've, kind of care about in the world. So I actually don't think that this is something that is kind of, yes, there's certainly some voice on the right that fixate on this and that have kind of popularized this discourse, but I certainly don't think it's unique to them. And I think that the interaction with immigration is really, really important. Now, part of what I think you were gesturing at is this argument that in a low fertility environment, you need a lot of immigrant inflows. That I think is debatable, right? Because it depends on what is it you actually care about. And look, the technological context is changing too. That's a thing that a lot of people, including a lot of people who have classically been champions of a cosmopolitan, open perspective, are really having to confront and think about. In a time when we're thinking about intelligent machines and how they're going to kind of remake the world, when you're thinking about how the technological shock of offshoring, that is the fact that more and more low-skilled, labor-intensive manufacturing is done outside of the United States and other affluent market democracies, that already changed the politics of immigration in a big way. There's a political scientist, Margaret Peters, who wrote about how the coalition for openness to low-skill immigration actually changed because you no longer had a garment industry in the country that was kind of fighting for that in particular. Then the argument for openness to low-skill immigration became more moralistic or humanitarian. It became a kind of identity brand rather than classic transactional interest group politics. So that was already a big change that we didn't really notice or recognize at the time. That's already had a big effect on the politics of immigration. And now I suspect that this new technological shock is going to do the same thing. Anyway, a lot more to say about that, but I hope that answered your question.
I just want to jump in. Your point about having a connection to the future and connecting it to the past reminds me of a few years ago, I was fielding a survey asking people about demographic change, and I had an open-ended question where I wanted people's reactions to the projection that the country would be majority-minority by 2044. And I was shocked at how many people wrote in the response, well, I'll be dead by then, so I don't think about it. And I really was not expecting that type of, that's the future. And so I had to reword it and say, how will things be similar or different for people like you, to get them to imagine a future and the people who will be in it. But I was really surprised at how many people just said, not
This
me.
is totally fascinating, partly because I think if you think about the mainstream, what do we think of as the mainstream? The mainstream is changing. You know, if you think about pop culture, if you think about beauty standards, what is normative, what is not, one thing that is interesting about the majority-minority conceit is that, well, think about, Americans of Latin American origin. How are they being incorporated? Are they seen as white? There are a lot of people who would totally reject the idea that they are white. But in terms of, and leave aside phenotype, when you think about the mainstream meaning, is my ethnic identity voluntary? Is it something that I can go in and out of? Is it something that is kind of binding me, or is it something that is a resource, a symbolic resource that I can draw on? I think that mainstream is actually pretty big. When you look at intermarriage patterns, there's colorism, there's all sorts of stratification that shapes those patterns, certainly, but the mainstream just looks different. There are a lot of people who are old stock Americans who have kids and grandkids, grandkids especially, who are, there are a lot of Americans who are 1/4 Mexican. There are a lot of, when I talk about the grandkids of the post-1965 generation, that's something that is really underway. Now, if you're in academia or in elite media, actually deploying the idea of marginalized minority status can be, but if you're like a kind of, ordinary middle-class person where you're not trying to get an SBA loan or something like that, it's just kind of different. You're just like, what is my life? What does my life look like? Who do I hang out with? What do I watch on television? What kind of church do I go to? And I think that is where you see that the mainstream is very big and dynamic. And one line of argument is that actually, in a way, we've made people too anxious about this prospect when, in fact, the mainstream is kind of evolving and proving kind of pretty kind of resilient and inclusive and expansive.
Hi. I saw that you were on Ross Douthat's show recently, last July. Last month, he had on Jeremy Carl, who sort of represents the backlash to this majority-minority future. He authored a recent book called The Unprotected Class. Trump nominated him for position at state. What do you make of his arguments and arguments like that more broadly?
Well, there are many aspects. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Jeremy Carl is a scholar at an organization called the Claremont Institute. He is someone who has a background in energy policy, a very varied background, also in public diplomacy. And his argument is that, unprotected class, what does that mean? So if you look at civil rights law, the idea is that there are certain people who belong to protected categories. And, the argument was that, kind of white Americans, white men, but also white Americans more broadly, belong to an unprotected category, and also that certain forms of anti-white discrimination and anti-white hatred have been normalized, have become routine in elite institutions, and that this, so, again, there are many aspects to his argument. You'd have to ask him to kind of give you a more chapter and verse reading, but that fundamental idea that, there is a kind of such a thing as anti-white discrimination or anti-white bias seems to me to be obviously true. Now, where do you rank that relative to all of the injustices in the world, or kind of, where is it most salient? There's a guy called Jacob Savage who wrote two articles for Compact magazine over the past 18 months. The first of them was about fiction. Kind of how many white male fiction writers are there under 40 who've been published, in the New Yorker and the Paris Review or kind of whatever else. And then he followed that up with another article talking about a kind of what might seem like a niche phenomenon, but looking at, white men in, call it, the culture industries more broadly, in Hollywood writers' rooms, kind of looking at, academia, kind of just a bunch of other contexts. But really for him, it was really focused on the entertainment industry. And it was a really kind of fascinating piece, it prompted a lot of soul searching, a lot of anguish. It prompted a lot of angry, vituperative reactions, kind of how dare you suggest such a thing, kind of et cetera. But I'll tell you that this is certainly a conversation that's unfolding, kind of among a lot of people. I'm 46 years old, so I'd say, my generation and younger, about how this has played out, what it's actually meant, where has this kind of energy been shunted off to? People who have not found opportunity in places where they would have found it, or believe that they haven't found this opportunity, right? And then, of course, one line of argument is it's excuse making, you're just whining, et cetera. And it's fascinating. And by the way, hey, maybe that's all true. But of course, would you make the same argument about, me as an aggrieved South Asian man, saying the same thing? Okay, so one thing that I find interesting about that phenomenon that Jacob Savage describes is that when you look at those Hollywood writers' rooms, who are the people who took the place of? Is that a fair way to characterize it? But let's just stipulate for the sake of argument. Who are the people who became included in much bigger numbers? And for me, this is interesting because I think a lot of the people who became included in much bigger numbers were people you might describe as white adjacent. That is, think about a South Asian, person who is a super assimilated, born in the United States, maybe went to a fancy college, but that person has the one big advantage of not literally being white. They're kind of figuratively white, or they kind of like maybe they belong to the mainstream. They have the same access. Again, maybe I'm being unfair here, but I think that I'm just kind of trying to talk to you and inhabit the perspective of someone who's looking at this landscape and thinking, gee, that's interesting. So, again, this is probably not the right place to litigate it, but I think that this is, one line of argument, one thing people are seeing. What they're seeing is that we now exist in this interesting, complex, multi-ethnic environment. And what they're seeing is that actually ethnicity and visible ethnicity is not just a disadvantage. It can also be an advantage. It can be an advantage for structural reasons. Maybe it's racial preferences, which is the kind of a version, an aspect of the argument Jacob Savage was making. It could also be a resource because guess what? When you have an ethnic community, it's not just symbolic capital, it can be real capital. It can be a source of cohesion and identity and meaning and purpose. It can be a way to coordinate and build relationships. And if you're someone who is you're at Tufts and you're from a family where your parents didn't go to a fancy college, you're kind of a lower middle class person from the middle of nowhere, and you're kind of like, well, what is the ethnic capital that I'm drawing on? What is my community that is bounded? Because for a long time, as kind of a white American, you weren't thinking of yourself as a white American, you were thinking of yourself as an American, and I have access to everything, and here I am. But then suddenly you're in this world that is this much more pluralistic, differentiated world in which people are looking for purchase. They're looking for something to grab onto. And I think that this is really, really interesting. And I think that it's something that is an absence that a lot of people are feeling. And by the way, it's also for many immigrants, right? When I think about Nick Fuentes, Nick Fuentes is, this really influential, I would argue pretty noxious political figure who, describes himself as America first, and he embraces a pretty frank and explicit white nationalism as someone who is himself someone who is part of this post-1965 America. He is, of Hispanic origin. And, it's interesting to see this expansion of the mainstream also means that the expansion of the aggrieved mainstream is also kind of quite big and complex. There are many people who come from minority backgrounds, according to the census, but who have what the scholar Eric Kaufman has called an ethno-traditional conception of American life. Ethno-traditional doesn't have to mean Nick Fuentes. That is kind of an extreme version, but ethno-traditional means that you don't have a purely post-national or cosmopolitan conception, right? It's a really fascinating landscape. It's really easy to be reductive about this. It's really easy to kind of caricature these different ideas. But I think that if you try to kind of approach it with some level of curiosity and empathy, I think you can learn a lot.
Most of the time, I don't need a microphone, but we'll play along. I am like you. My parents came here in 1946 at the end of World War II. From a place like yours, I'm Cape Verdean, so I'm first generation, and now my children are. So I went through kind of like the process you went through, except mine was a little more rougher. I grew up in the 60s. So I was the first of, I used to call it OBG. I was the only black guy, and the girl was the only black girl in all the classes. And I was, high achiever. And every time I stepped into a forum, that whole gain and acceptance thing. Nowadays, I look at a stat that drives me insane in politics. Because I keep hearing this word mainstream. I keep hearing politicians on both sides saying that the majority of Americans. But yet, when I look at the stat, I see that Kamala got 31%. Donald J. Trump got 33%. That leaves a higher number of 36% that didn't choose either one of them. So why do we keep saying that the majority of America, or the Republicans, won the election? I think the election was truly won by the 36% that decided they did not like anybody, that they just want to be Americans. They want to be the true Americans. Because this whole thing about defining what an American is, by the way, I'm a Gulf War, I'm a 3-time combat vet. I've served, Grenada, Panama, and the Gulf. So I did that too. And my family is global, completely global. We're the only ones here in America. And my cousins overseas, when you talk to your family overseas, their view of America is what they see on their version of their news. Just like middle America only sees one version of one thing.
Can you ask a question?
Yeah. So how come neither side talks about that 36% is my question.
Thank you.
Well, look, I mean, your question is a little conclusory, right? I mean, you're kind of assuming that I agree with you on this. Look, there are a lot of Americans who certainly don't identify with a side. I think that's true. I guess one observation that I'll make, pivoting off of your remarks, is that I think that our political system is really dynamic. And our political parties are not classic political parties in the sense that these are conventions of law. They have ballot access, they have a very entrenched position, they're coordinating devices, but they're losing their ideological coherence. And because of that, basically they are really changing, in terms of what is their kind of ideological makeup, what is it that defines them. We're polarized, but the kind of grounds for that polarization are different. It's often observed that the Republican Party is increasingly the party of people who distrust institutions, and the Democratic Party is more the party of people who trust institutions. That is a bit of a reversal. There was a group of people who had been really anti-institutional, skeptical, and what have you, who've now kind of gravitated, left to right, or there are new cohorts, kind of whatever that are being incorporated, kind of, more through this lens. So I guess, one thing that I would, say to all of you is that it's important to kind of remember that these are dynamic processes, and that while there are some continuities, I think that these continuities are overwhelmed by the ways in which, as the electorate changes and as circumstances change. I remember predicting that the Affordable Care Act and the really intense, ferocious debate over the Affordable Care Act would just totally go away, within the space of, kind of 5-6 years. And there's still debates over exactly what it ought to look like, but the debate is not over whether or not to repeal the Affordable Care Act anymore. You know what I mean? You create facts on the ground, and then the new zones of contestation just kind of move. And that's something that you kind of need to be sensitive to and appreciate that's going to kind of keep happening.
I do want to just briefly build on that, though, and talk a little bit about voter turnout and how there's lots of change in lots of places in a short period of time over making voting easier, but also making voting harder. And while it's really difficult to demonstrate disparate impacts of some of the changes that have been implemented, there's perceptions that these are being implemented to shape the electorate.
Well,
and so I wonder if you can talk about—
Professor Hirsch is an expert on this, and he has a forthcoming book on the subject. Look, I think that there is a lot of misperception about, what's happening. One big thing to note, whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, and I'm not sure, but, voter turnout is doing pretty well. If you're looking at ease of voting, if you're looking at access, there have been a lot of reforms. If you're looking at, early voting, it's really kind of quite extraordinary. So I think that there continues to be a lot of discontent about that, and I think that a lot of it is symbolic in character. I think that there are some kind of discrete, but look, I mean, one reason you have very high turnout, you don't have high turnout when people are thrilled. So the 1990s, when there was so much anxiety about how low voter turnout was, in hindsight, that looks like a relatively halcyon period, kind of in American political life, the kind of sense that actually the stakes were not all that high. If Bill Clinton or Bob Dole won the presidency in 1996, again, we can debate that, but I think that certainly there was a feeling that that was true. If you look at the mayoral race in New York City that we just had in 2025, turnout was unbelievably high. I don't think turnout was high because people were thinking everything is perfectly fine, and I feel totally chill about who these candidates are. Zohran Mamdani won just over 50% of the vote, but he also sparked turnout from an enormous number of people who wanted to vote against him. Turnout was also very high in New York City in 1989 and 1993. That was not a very chill time in the politics of New York City. I think that that's kind of one way to think about this. Kind of, is it necessarily always and everywhere good for turnout to be high? We can debate that. There's some people who favor something like the Australian system where you have, a soft mandate that everyone vote, and the argument is that that has some effect on kind of representation and the kind of coloration of politics in Australia. That's certainly open to debate. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about where we are.
So you worked at the New Republic. I guess that might have been under Peter Beinart, when you worked at the New Republic. And I went to college with him. I knew him quite well. So I want to talk about that maybe over dinner. But the New Republic was, at the time, more of a left-leaning publication. So I wanted to ask you, did you sort of change ideologically over the course of the period? Or did you find that working for the New Republic at the time was quite open to people of all sorts of views when you were there in the late 90s? That's my first question. That's the easy one. Second, more and more difficult, what are your views on the Compact for Excellence in Higher Education? Well, I have you up here. I'd like to get some of your thoughts on how you feel it's all going. Not to link you with Chris Rufo, but obviously your colleagues, and he has a very strong position on what he felt with the ills of higher education. And a year into this project, how do you feel that it's going?
Well, the first thing, and this is, this is a subject of great interest to me. I would commend to you all, if you're interested in the intellectual history of post-war America, a book by Martin Peretz called The Controversialist, which is really, really fascinating, both for the kind of gossipy element of the book, but also just because Martin Peretz was someone who is involved in a lot of different controversies that continue to be controversies in public life today. So the New Republic was a quirky magazine at that time. It was very heterodox, and it was a magazine that, among other things, had a very firm commitment to Zionism. For a variety of reasons, I then and continue to consider myself someone who is a believer in and supporter of Zionism. The New Republic also always had this kind of neoconservative current to it. So one reason I worked at the New Republic is that Andrew Sullivan had been an editor there, and he is someone who had been, someone with whom I disagree about plenty, but someone who was a friend and kind of mentor to me, and I did some work with him then, and also a guy called Lawrence Kaplan. There were a lot of people. So at the time, the New Republic was a big believer in an assertive U.S. foreign policy, and again, many people, including the person that you just mentioned a moment ago, who had worked at the New Republic at the time, had very different views then. So I would say there's actually a fair bit of continuity in my views between 2001 and the present. Certainly my views evolved between when I was, say, 13 years old and kind of 21. But, and probably for, certainly my views have evolved, over the past, 25 years. But, I certainly thought of myself as being on the right then. Now, with respect to higher education, I believe that higher education and the kind of implicit compact that exists with higher education right now, in which the federal government really makes an enormous open-ended investment in higher education directly and indirectly, I don't think it's going especially well for a lot of different reasons. We can get into how and why. I believe that the way we approach subsidized student loans does an enormous amount of damage to vulnerable people. I think that that's a big, big problem. I believe that when you're looking at, kind of how and why it is we fund higher education, and again, this is such a big, complex phenomenon. We fund it in a lot of different ways. There are many different institutions. This is a big, complex landscape. But I see a lot that I don't see as good. And I think that it's pretty reasonable in a country like ours to think, particularly when, I believe, and I think the president disagrees with me, but I believe we're going to need some serious fiscal consolidation. I think that there's we talked about demographics and fertility and much else before. I think when you're looking at student populations, I just think that there's a big shock that is coming to higher education that you're starting to see. More vulnerable institutions are experiencing it more right now, but there's a big, big shock that's going to affect the entire sector. And I think that now, I think yesterday would have been a better time to really think really deeply about how do we kind of change that relationship? How do we revise that relationship? From a lot of different vantage points. So I think to the extent you were thinking that we are going to make this public investment in higher education, I think thinking, okay, well, how do we think about what we want higher education to do for the country? In the Cold War, you saw the advent of area studies. You saw this kind of whole ideological project. You saw this kind of project of the defense industrial base to kind of deploy the kind of intellectual capital of the American university. But through that project, the American university swelled enormously. And so I guess one question is that the natural state of things, the kind of hypertrophy of American higher education that you've seen during this period of time, that has also then created a ton of other constituencies. When the federal government, when the Trump administration says we're going to target Columbia or we're going to target Harvard or we're going to target, kind of whichever institution, lo and behold, it has massive reverberations for real estate values in Brookline, Massachusetts. And then it turns out that President Trump has a bunch of allies who are loyal alums or who are people who kind of themselves are economically enmeshed with these big complex institutions. And then he kind of backs off or doesn't. This is a really kind of big fraught question when you're looking at what a pretty chaotic presidency is kind of doing and approaching this. But then when you're looking at the larger question of does this compact need to be renewed or rethought? I think the answer is clearly yes. And I think the big interesting thing that's happened over the last 10 years, so preceding this second Trump presidency, faith in higher education among self-identified Republicans has been pretty low for a pretty long time. Faith among independents, kind of not great. What really has happened over the last 10 years is the collapse in faith in higher education among self-identified Democrats. And that's been really interesting. And I think that already prompted a lot of soul searching and a lot of conversation within these institutions. But I think that then this external shock, which again, how is that external shock going to actually play out when you have a lot of inconstancy, from President Trump and his administration, a lot of lack of focus? We'll see. But I think that external shock has made a big difference. I'd be delighted to talk to you about this further offline.
I wanted to go back to your point about adversarial assimilation. So what I've noticed from my, albeit limited life experience, is that there's definitely a desire not to fully assimilate and to have your own culture. Because obviously you're not going to come to the country and then India, never heard of it. Or in the World Cup, which is coming up, yes, we support the US, but also just as much whatever country we come from. So I wanted to ask, when you talk about adversarial assimilation, is it something that can be solved? Is it something we want to fully solve? Or when you talk about it, how do you go about that?
Well, I would frame it a little differently. So, so the thing that I really want to underscore is that assimilation is always a pluralistic or variegated phenomenon, right? Because, the United States, we got about 340 million people. And, if you are someone who has moved to the United States, from Golders Green, from North London, and you're kind of a really observant Zionistic Jew, and you're moving to the Upper West Side, kind of like you're going to assimilate to America, but you're going to assimilate perhaps to a particular slice of America, right? And that is true of everybody. So when my parents came to Brooklyn in the mid-1970s, there was virtually no kind of Bengali-speaking community. However, over the course of my life, it grew, it mushroomed, and my father was someone who was very enmeshed in it, and it was really important to him, and it was important to all of us. But my life experience, partly by virtue of the assimilation context that I experienced, was just kind of different, right? So the people who are arriving from Bangladesh today, they're arriving, with a population in the outer boroughs of New York City that has tens of thousands of people, that it actually has significant political muscle. It's just a different thing. Also, you've got WhatsApp, you've got like a million, just the experience of being kind of a newcomer and in an enclave. What even is the enclave? It actually just is really, really different now. And that's not necessarily adversarial. What you're describing is kind of, you could call it selective acculturation. So think about the ways in which, if you're a newcomer and you're coming into a community that has dangers, right? So your parents want to protect you from those dangers. Those dangers could be, literally, oh, I don't want my kids to get involved in joining a violent criminal gang. Okay, that could be one danger. Another danger could be, I don't really love the sexual licentiousness of American culture or whatever else. So one thing could be, I'm trying to give my children antibodies to aspects of the wider culture that I find insalubrious or I find kind of dangerous, but maybe, counterproductive from an other kind of assimilation goal, right? So it could be that, hey, actually, if my kids assimilate to the kind of local environment in this kind of chaotic, dangerous environment in which I feel like there are a lot of people who are deeply anti-institutional, they don't trust school, they don't want to be invested in whatever, I want them to assimilate into another slice of American life. So the way that I can do that is actually by reinforcing their sense of strength and resilience, by taking selectively aspects of the home country culture where it's already kind of confected, right? Because, you're already in the kind of diaspora. What are you borrowing and choosing? This is a kind of classic trope that when you're looking at immigrants and you're looking at, so-called diaspora communities, what they're preserving is oftentimes really different from what's happening in the home country, because the home country is always constantly evolving and changing, right? So it could be that they're taking a snapshot in amber. The Islam that I grew up with was a syncretic, Sufi-inflected Islam where there were people who would take part in Hindu pujas, festivals. And actually these communities were really thickly enmeshed together. And my ethnic immigrant community was actually dominated not by other Muslim people of Bangladeshi origin, but by Hindus. Now, if you're looking at what was going on in Bangladesh throughout the time of my upbringing, that context totally changed. The words that I would use that were Persian in origin now are not used. And actually someone will kind of, be a little suspicious were I to use those things that were the things that were a classic part of being a Muslim, from this kind of 700-year tradition in that part of the world. So I think that is always going to be true. And then it relates to the prestige of ethnic capital. Is your ethnic capital valuable in this new kind of multi-ethnic pluralistic context or not? So think about it this way. India is a country that today, in 2026, I think at least some people would think of it as pretty cool. India is a country that is producing unicorns. India is a country that is kind of, so then, oh gosh, think about there are negative stereotypes, but there are also positive stereotypes. So because I look a certain way, there might be people, I'll say something offensive, there might be people who assume that I'm better at math than I really am, right? So, it's actually, this thing that actually you can leverage a stereotype in a way that actually helps you navigate the world and kind of achieve your objectives. You can leverage the fact that you have access to some kind of cultural tradition that is kind of separate from the kind of openness, some would say kind of chaos of kind of like, kind of mainstream culture. And that is something that is really interesting. And it's also something that I think can engender envy and resentment as well. So when I think about anti-Semitism in America right now, it's something that I think a lot about. One thing I find so fascinating is that, look, the Jewish population, kind of has been a big and important presence in American life for a really long time. But within that population, you do have a kernel of it that is observant, that is kind of Zionistic, that really is invested in sustaining some kind of shared communal life, and where there's been a multi-generational project of selective acculturation or selective assimilation. We will assimilate and we will embrace American life in a big, robust way. We are proud of our American identity. We will do that. We will go all in. But also, yes, we want to have Jewish grandchildren. And yes, actually, we are willing to say that actually it is valuable and important to not intermarry. Something that, in the wider culture, the wider secular liberal culture would be seen as really kind of taboo or strange, unless you actually have some reason to kind of believe it. So what's interesting to me when you're looking at some of these post-1965 communities is which ones will have a similar ethos. And then, this is a weird thing to say, but like in the kind of marriage and mating and sexual marketplace, bluntly, there are some identities that have momentum and have capital, and there are others that don't. So if you want to actually sustain that as a kind of distinct community, there are a few ways to do it. One is shunning. That is, you have to exert a cost. Hey, you can go out and leave the community and marry someone outside the community, but if you do, you're going to be locked out from access to certain kinds of capital and relationship, okay? That's really interesting. Or it could be, something else. It could be that actually this is such a rich and exciting and vital and vibrant community that you want to be a part of it. We're not going to shun, but actually, oh gosh, isn't this kind of great and important? But you need people who are willing to sustain it and willing to invest the energy in that. And that's something I find really, really interesting. Which communities are going to survive and which aren't? And also, will people come to see actually having that vital communal core as being enviable? And will you start seeing multi-generational old stock Americans adopting an ethnic identity that is not necessarily theirs? Tulsi Gabbard, the director of national intelligence, is someone who is, I believe, of Samoan origin, at least in part, but is someone who embraced Hinduism. It's a somewhat idiosyncratic choice, but kind of not totally unheard of. And you do see upper middle class people, in America are thinking, I want to enroll my, kids who are like half Slovak, half Chinese, or half Slovak and half Italian, kind of many generations back, in a Chinese immersion school. Because they're thinking, how can I actually find some way to build up my kids' antibodies to what I see as some aspects of our culture that I worry about? And I worry about the fact that I feel so deracinated, that I don't have something to kind of grip and kind of grab onto.
Hi.
Yeah, I was just curious, switching gears just a little bit. Like, it's no secret that we're a pretty polarized country here in the United States. I was curious on what you see the future of that dynamic being with ideologies shifting, and how you see polarization either changing, decreasing, increasing in the future, especially with, for example, Trump, this being his last term and what he decides to do after office. And I was curious on kind of your opinion as someone who sees the conservative movement, what you see that looking like in the future.
Oh, well, you've asked like 6 questions in your question, and I'm already exhausting everybody else in here. So, the way that I see this is there are 2 different things happening. One is there's kind of party politics, and there is what is the market clearing price. How can I actually create an efficient coalition to kind of win the Electoral College? Or kind of, there's this whole concept of like, what is an efficient coalition? Because if my coalition is too big, then I have to share the spoils with too many different people. So like, I kind of don't want my coalition to be too big, but then I don't want it to be so small that I lose, right? So you're just trying to kind of perfectly hit this zone. And I think that American politics feels incredibly efficient. And then it's also, there are different majorities that matter. So there's a majority that matters in the US Senate. There's a majority that matters for the US House of Representatives. There's a majority that matters for the presidency. You know what I mean? Like they're different majorities at different times. And, you could argue that, the rural party is going to have some structural advantages in the Senate. But then you can also argue that if you think about media, ideas, kind of how, kind of who is dominating the kind of context in which people are educated. The kind of party of the credentialed has a structural advantage, kind of in shaping ideas and kind of how they're effectuated. So there are kind of lots of different ways to kind of think about this. And I think that sometimes there's kind of backward justification. So, Donald Trump was a kind of political innovator who developed this synthesis that wound up basically devastating this kind of incumbent Republican political class. He was seeing trends that he had kind of identified, and he really leaned into them. And he used the fact that he was able to leverage a huge amount of free media by virtue of his celebrity and his ability to provoke. And kind of in provoking a response, he actually dominated the airwaves even more. He was able to kind of do that with a kind of pretty straightforward ideological thesis, and different people will characterize it differently. To basically wipe out, this kind of whole group of people who came before him. But it's not as though this kind of interests cease to exist or whatever else, and they try to assert themselves. And then there are a bunch of coalition merchants. There are a bunch of people who are themselves people who think of themselves as purveyors of ideas, who have here's how I make sense of this. What Donald Trump really meant is this. Or actually, if I want to cement this coalition that he created, here are the ideas. So it can happen both ways. It can be there's a coalition merchant, there's someone who has a set of ideas who then kind of is offering this hypothesis to this is what the coalition could look like to advance these ideas. And then sometimes there's just a politician who kind of comes in, and then you create a backward justification for what that person did, because that's the way that you kind of you lend prestige to your idea by saying that, this person who wins, my ideas are that person's ideas. But then when that person, in the case of Donald Trump, is just really mercurial, and he has a lot of different ideas, and maybe there's kind of one or two where he's really consistent, but others where he's not. So then it's this kind of weird zone, where exactly do you land? So then there's a separate conversation about conservatism. What is it? What do we mean? And which I'd be happy to talk to you about, at great length. But I think that it's certainly true that we have a lot of things that are happening at once that suggest to me that the ideological landscape is going to look pretty different relatively soon. So one is that, this class inversion that's kind of happened, is that a durable phenomenon? We'll see. If we turn to a politics of fiscal consolidation, how is that going to change things? Because we've had a period of really large deficits for a long time that has enabled all kinds of kind of political change. It's played out differently in blue states versus red states, but it's had really, really big consequences. And then, the labor market and kind of AI and whether or not that winds up being something really, really consequential. And then the kind of ethnic incorporation of newcomer populations into both the kind of mass electorate and the elite. I think on the elite side, we've seen a lot of ways in which newcomer populations have really shaped our politics already. So again, I think that we're going to see a lot more of that.
Hi. So a few weeks ago, the center hosted a conversation about school choice. So it's a topic that a lot of us have thought about a lot. And I saw on your Wikipedia page that it's one of the issues that the Manhattan Institute works on. So I was wondering if you could speak to your views on it, how your work fits into it, and how it fits into our broader conversation today.
There are a lot of different ways to think about it. So one big debate, one big divide that's emerged among people who think of themselves as partisans of school choice is the debate between, are we thinking about this through the lens of very structured programs where we are taking, kind of evidence-based models, high-performing charter networks, and facilitating their growth in a way where we're being very mindful of how we're structuring choice to ensure that it is compatible with some other equities. Let's say, we really care about socioeconomic diversity within schools or kind of whatever else. And a reason for making this compromise, let's your baseline, your default, is that I want public provision. I think that that's the right thing to do. I want it to be government driven. I want there to be a certain kind of shared civic or whatever. Like, I really believe in the public role being kind of dominant here. And maybe I'll make a concession here, because I've seen some empirical evidence to suggest that particularly low-income students from disadvantaged backgrounds happen to benefit from certain really well-specified, well-defined models. I will then allow school choice in that limited context. That's kind of one view, okay? And that the idea was that that is the thing that had, for a time had some bipartisan support. It's in the context of high stakes testing, accountability, et cetera. Then there is another view, which is a view that what we need is education pluralism, what we need is education freedom. And actually, when we're thinking about the role of public education or the public subsidy of education in our society, we should take a much bigger, more expansive view, for a variety of reasons. I would say that we, my organization, the folks that I work with, they're not all marching in lockstep. They all would think of themselves as partisans of school choice. Some of them are more in the former camp. I want something that is very structured and, kind of in this kind of one setting, and that's something I'm comfortable with. I'd say most of us are in the latter camp. That is, we really do believe that pluralism is really good and important. Why do we believe that? So I was talking to you guys before a little bit about identity, membership, belonging, inclusion, things like that. And there's this line of argument that you can take or leave, but that I'm persuaded by, which is that schools work best when you love your school. Schools work best when actually the parent, the family, they feel invested in the school and they feel like the school really reflects their values and sensibilities in a deep way. And that fosters this kind of stronger attachment. And it just makes the school kind of stickier and more meaningful. Now, are there downsides to that? 100%. I'm sure there kind of, would be downsides to that. And, is that something where, you want to have some thoughtful regulation? Sure. But I think the general orientation of a lot of people in my world is that, yes, we accept that there might be some risks associated with this shift, but the potential benefits of it are big enough that we should kind of make that move. So again, there's a lot more to talk about specifically, but the big picture, public policy change is that there are many states, particularly, kind of call them more conservative states, where there's been an embrace of so-called ESAs, education savings accounts or spending accounts, where the idea is rather than, hey, we're going to allow charters, we're going to go beyond that. We'll allow charters, but we'll also be willing to give families some, cash-like, kind of vehicle that you could disaggregate and use in a bunch of different ways. You could use it for tuition at an independent or parochial school, or you might actually, as a homeschooler, you might want to use it in a lot of different ways. You might want to use it to kind of allow for all different kinds of supplementary instruction or what have you. And I think that, one of the reasons, my colleague Roland Fryer is a big believer in this is that, the big question is, what is the supply response? How does that look? And if, kind of you're doing something that's kind of big enough, then you can get a different kind of supply response when it comes to instructional providers, other providers as well. But look, there absolutely, it entails some risk, just as, kind of the way that we've approached subsidized student loans, has absolutely subsidized incredibly damaging things, in my view. I think that something like this, kind of, would you kind of be able to identify ways in which, there's a parent or, kind of that use this money, really carelessly and destructively? Absolutely. As someone who has gone to public schools, kind of someone who sends my children to public schools, I believe that there's a lot of money in district public schools that is used thoughtlessly, wastefully, in ways that, feel more driven by politics than by pedagogy. But, of course, so I think that there's no world in which we're going to be free of risk. And I do think that the politics of this have really changed markedly. So anyway, I'm an enthusiast, but I think that it's helpful to think about the kind of broader context.
Hi, so I'm wondering, you've spoken a lot about shifting demographics and increasing immigration, and we've seen that President Trump's response to this increasing immigration has been through his mass deportation campaign, and I'm curious what your desired federal policy response to immigration would be.
Well, I wrote this book in 2018 that now feels, very out of date. But, my kind of banal take is that when you're looking at the unauthorized population, it is, I keep talking about, things being different, right? This population is really, it's not a single population. So you have millions of people who have citizen children or even citizen spouses. Now, you might be wondering, how is it that you can have a U.S. citizen spouse but not, not be authorized, not have lawful status? And one way is that we treat unauthorized immigrants, unauthorized non-citizens differently if they entered without inspection or if they overstayed a visa. If you overstayed a visa, oftentimes there are more kind of pathways for you than if you entered without inspection. So the population is really, really complex. And one thing that I believe would be a sensible thing to do is to start thinking about how do we not think about this as one single population, because it's not. But then how do we start thinking about, call it salami slicing, kind of like this is kind of one population that has these characteristics. How do we kind of think about a solution for this population and so on? But I think that, for a variety of reasons, I think that it's very hard to imagine having some legislative solution along those lines, because first of all, we've totally, our ability to have legislative solutions is kind of totally broken down because of distrust. And that distrust is not always misplaced. So if you're looking at folks who are, anti-immigration or who kind of care a lot about, removing folks who are unauthorized, there's been a lot of work on public opinion among these people. And, what you are these different groups. And what you see is that, a lot of people just have a categorical objection. No matter what characteristics, no matter how long you talk about someone having been in the country or whatever else, they're like, nope, if you came in unlawfully, boom, it kind of simply doesn't matter. That's a very, very big group. It's not a majority, but it's kind of like, estimates vary, but, there are some who say it's as much as a third. Now, then it's also, these things are thermostatic. So basically, opinion on immigration really changes. There was a lot of support for mass deportation when President Biden was in office. Now, partly because this is mediated through what are people seeing? What are the images that are people seeing, right? So then, you have a Trump administration that in some cases wants to create images that are really kind of shocking, and they want certain kinds of coverage. It might be because, they believe that will have a deterrent effect. But another effect that it has is that it has a thermostatic effect on public opinion. So, you had large numbers of people who favored mass deportation like 2 years ago who are now opposed to it, right? So I think that this is why when it comes to a political or legal operation of any kind, the way that people have classically thought about this is that you don't want to go against the weakest claimants, the kind of people, you don't want to create, kind of scenes at the airport. You want to actually be very disciplined about how you're doing this. If this sounds very dark to you, I apologize. But the fundamental thing is like you want to focus on the least sympathetic population, right? And I think that what's happened with the Trump administration is that they wound up approaching this in a way that was, kind of chaotic and something where they began, it seemed, with wanting to focus on criminal aliens, let's say, but then it became much broader than that. Some in the administration would argue it's because we didn't get adequate cooperation or whatever else. But what it's done is it's materially affected things for the moment. Are you going to get another thermostatic backlash? I believe you will. You know what I mean? These things just kind of veer really violently because there's no one thinking about how do we actually land in some place that feels more or less stable. Now, you said increasing immigration before, and one thing I'll just note is that a lot of what I'm talking about is actually how past immigration think about like a snake swallowing a rabbit, can have really big effects that kind of change, even if actually immigrant inflows are actually quite low. And they're actually quite low right now for a variety of reasons. One is that unauthorized entries at the border are a lot lower, but also because you have the Trump administration making public charge determinations. You have them who are kind of looking at kind of legal channels very differently because the executive branch has really wide discretion. So we're going to start seeing this more soon, but actually the inflows are way lower right now. That's one driver. The other driver is, just as I mentioned before, demography within source countries. So this whole landscape is going to look really different. And one way to think about it, let's zoom out as historians. It could be that we will see the kind of, call it 1970 to like 2015 period as one big, just as we now think about the kind of 1880 to 1920 period as like a big influx that really had a big effect on the country, that is going to continue to have reverberations for many decades. But it's possible that that wave, whether you like it or not, whether you have a new administration that's a progressive administration that wants to really ramp up immigration, something was very special and unique about that time from a demographic perspective, a technological perspective. It could be that you're going to get a left of center administration that is very cosmopolitan, but that is dominated by people who are very alarmed about what AI is doing to white collar work. And therefore, a la Zoe Lofgren in the 90s, is kind of offering a kind of left labor case for, they won't call it immigration restriction, they'll call it something else, but it will be immigration restriction. Just as Jacinda Ardern, the kind of, left of center Prime Minister of New Zealand said, oh, well, I'm a cosmopolitan, I love immigrants, but we're gonna shut down all immigration because of the housing crisis. So anyway, be open to surprises and possibilities like that. Because one big thing is that we always think down the track of how things have always been and what we think they're necessarily going to look like. And I want you to think that actually things could wind up looking really, really different, because what is the commitment that is really durable and solid? And what are the other commitments where you can kind of pay lip service to them, but that actually can move pretty quickly in response to some kind of technological or cultural or ideological shock?
Thank you.